Genesis chapter 9, verses 8 through 17. Hear the word of the Lord. Then God said to Noah and his sons with him, "As for me, I am establishing my covenant with you and your descendants after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the domestic animals, and every animal of the earth with you, as many as came out of the ark. I establish my covenant with you that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of a flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth." God said, "This is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you, for all future generations. I have set my bow in the clouds, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh, and the waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth." God said to Noah, "This is the sign of the covenant that I have established between me and all flesh that is on the earth." The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. We have some bad traditions and history and biblical interpretation. We all do. I discovered some of the depths of this when I embarked on a process of teaching seminary extension students how to read and interpret the Bible. It was much worse than I had imagined, especially when we turned to look at the first 11 chapters of Genesis. Somehow those texts which seem most familiar to us are the ones we have the greatest difficulty in understanding. We have always known to be true as a difficult starting point when we go to analyze a text with care. We see too many emotional attachments to these stories. Stories we heard in our formative years and which we accepted and processed without really giving them too much thought. When we pause to reread them, apart from our traditions and emotional ties, they may seem very different to us than the stories that are stuck in our heads. Can we set aside the traditional assumptions that we bring to these texts to hear them as they were actually intended? One of the missionary groups working with illiterate peoples around the globe developed what they called chronological Bible storying. The idea was to help these peoples who depended on oral storying to come into contact with the Bible as story. Some 2/3 of the Bible is story naturally. It is narrative and framework. And so they began fusing together stories and trying to piece them together in what they considered an appropriate chronology to expose illiterate peoples around the globe with the message and meaning of the Bible. There's a lot to be said for their intent. There was a lot to be said for the strategies they developed and the understanding that narrative is a powerful tool to tell theology. There's a lot to be said for understanding that the Bible is by and large theological narrative. And we would do well to learn so much from that. But as I began preparing for a ministry in theological education by extension and looked at the materials that this group was using, I recognized right off the bat that while there was a lot of value in their ideas and what they were trying to accomplish, they were really missing the boat in terms of doing the hard and diligent work of appropriate study of the biblical text on which to base their work. You see, they were beginning with their doctrines and theology, and then running to the Bible to find stories that would back up what they understood to be true. As I began preparing for my work with Extension Seminary students, I recognized a need to prepare them before we could get into this storytelling understanding of the Bible, to do the hard, diligent work of understanding the narratives that we were dealing with. When we come to texts like this one in Genesis chapter 9, it is part of a larger arc of stories. It is one text among many that are developed to answer some of the theological issues alive in the environs of ancient Israel. It was a response to other theological stories. It was a response to theologies, or what we call the mythologies, of the ancient lands which would be later known as Babylon, where Abraham had left his ancestors to journey with Yahweh to the land of promise. A land where later on the Jews would encounter once again these same mythologies in the words of the Babylonians. And these stories that we find here in Genesis, especially 1 through 11, were crafted with full awareness of these competing ideas and ideologies and understandings of the world and the world of the gods. When we arrive at this flood narrative for Jewish and Hebrew readers, they did not start with a clean slate, but rather they encountered this story in the context of other stories. Theological narratives that told of the clash among gods and how the gods of Babylon were disturbed because humankind was making too much noise and not allowing them to sleep. So the gods had constructed this idea that they would eradicate humanity from the face of the earth, and then they would be able to get some peace and quiet at last. That a human hero is warned of this plot, and by personal initiative and strength, he goes and he builds this great, huge box to rescue people and animals from the impending disaster. And at the conclusion of the flood, he himself becomes responsible for feeding the gods as he offers sacrifice, rescuing them from their whims, ill-conceived strategies and plots. The story we find here in Genesis is a far cry from that Babylonian account. But more than anything, it is a far cry in terms of its theology. It's understanding of the identity and character of Yahweh. Not simply about who God is, but how God is. What God desires. What God expects of humanity, and how God responds to us when we don't really measure up. You see, these stories are not simply history written down that we might know what happened in times long past. Rather, they are theological accounts that help us understand the identity and character of the one we call God. The one who created life and a world that could support life itself. The one who fashioned heavens and earth and set limits for the sea. The one who created life and called it into existence and placed humanity as the crowning achievement of this work of creation. The account we have is a very different account from the Babylonian myths. It is a different account here than the other stories that we have seen in Genesis 1 through 11. We find in these narratives a merger of different traditions within Judaism, pointing together toward something greater than any one of the traditions alone can manage to accomplish. We find at least two accounts of creation, Genesis 1 through chapter 2, verse 4a, and then Genesis chapters 2 and 3. Competing accounts not to give us different notions of how God created, but presenting us with different aspects of God's character, identity, and purpose. Yet when we come to the flood narrative, we find that traditions have been merged together into one new story. It is a narrative that dialogues between the traditions within Jerusalem, or within Judaism, and also strikes a dissonant chord of conversation with the Babylonian myths. But it does more than that. After the Jewish fashion of how you do storytelling, you might sit around a campfire at night and retell the sacred stories. But then in the process of the risen day, you walk the fields and hash out with one another the meaning of those stories and how they should impact our lives, our understanding of Yahweh, and how Yahweh would interface with us. They are calls to theological reflection, much more than simple history. They are theological narrative. And the one at hand for us today in our passage is no less theological reflection. It speaks of God placing his bow in the clouds. And while we are on one level correct in recalling the rainbow that we see of light reflected against clouds after a rainstorm, the term that the account uses refers rather to God's war implement, his weapon of war, weapon of hunting. And God takes this weapon, this bow, and sets it in the clouds, saying, I am hanging it up here. It is not my will and purpose to condemn and judge and wipe out humanity for their misdeeds. Rather, I choose to act in grace, mercy, and compassion. I hang up my bow because wiping out humanity for their misdeeds accomplishes nothing. It does not cleanse the heart. It does not cleanse the human race from trying to seek its own way in opposition to God's direction. You see, we stop too soon when we reflect on these stories. We go through the motions of remembering the stories told to us when we were children, and rarely pause to reflect on what these theological narratives tell us about the identity and character of God. It should be obvious to us that Yahweh would well understand that unleashing a flood upon the earth to cleanse it of all evildoers would not solve the sin problem. In fact, the following verses flesh out for us the fact that sin is still alive and well and working within Noah and his sons. The first words that Noah utters are a curse upon his grandson, wiping out evildoers in just condemnation becomes a pointless exercise. It is not redeeming. It does not correct. It does not change who we are. It does nothing to alter our character and makeup, our intentions and our purposes. Rather, as we would reflect upon this story, it would cause us to ponder with Job and with Jesus why we should expect God to visit punishment and condemnation and death upon those who do wrong as a way of sanctifying the world. For God's purpose goes far beyond condemnation and punishment. God's desire is love and grace, reconciliation and restoration. Now, the conclusion that we likely should come to after good theological reflection on this narrative is that there is a reason that God has not wiped out humanity over and over and over again. As horrible as World War II and Hitler's Nazi Party were, with the death and destruction of 6 million Jews, Simply killing them does not end the human penchant for violence and dehumanizing our fellow man. As Jesus said, do you think those on whom the tower of Siloam fell were worse sinners than all others in the land? No, that is a false theology. Because the character and identity of God is other than our projections of our own selfish personal desires for revenge and condemnation of those who do not measure up to our expectations. And yet God takes his bow and he sets it in the clouds to remind us that violence does not cleanse the world of evil. That grace is greater than condemnation and judgment. That Yahweh is a God of mercy, not for humanity alone, but the Creator willing to rejoice in all of creation, in all of its wonderful diversity. When will we likewise be willing to set our weapons in the clouds and follow along with the identity and character of God, who rather offers himself for our redemption?